Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice at Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy at CEPA. And I'm really delighted to have you all with us and to welcome Professor Leah Stokes to this public talk. Thanks to my colleagues, Professors Geoff Heel and Scott Barrett at the Center at CEPA for agreeing to host and moderate. And on behalf of the Center on Global Energy Policy, I just wanted to take 1 minute to say we're delighted not only to have Leah with us today, but to have her as part of our visiting faculty program this semester. Our mission at the Center on Global Energy Policy is to bring together the fundamental research done at a university like Columbia with expertise in policy design and implementation to help deliver smart solutions to our climate and energy challenges. And few people better combine academic research with public policy engagement than Leah. She's the author of a very interesting recent book, Short Circuiting Policy, about the utility industry's role in the policy process. She is just out today with a new report I'm sure she will talk about on what the argument for a clean electricity standard to decarbonize electricity by 2035 would be, and importantly, how that might work through the budget reconciliation process, which would require 51, not 60 senators to support it. Among her many, I won't read her whole bio, Geoff or Scott may do that, but among her many distinguished academic credentials, I will just note she's one of us at CEPA, having completed an MPA in environmental science and policy at CEPA and the Earth Institute here at Columbia. So Leah, thank you so much for making time to be with all of us today. And let me turn it to you, Geoff Heel, who's the chair of the Faculty Advisory Committee at the Center.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So as Jason said, I'm Geoff Heel. I'm a professor of economics in the business school, and I'm also affiliated with Jason's Center, which is a great pleasure. I really enjoy that. So the Center is sponsoring a series of visits by distinguished academics who are interested in the energy field from various perspectives. We started this year, we'd obviously hoped to have people in person, but unfortunately everything has gone virtually so far. Though we're hoping that by the fall, we'll be able to bring people together in person. So Leah is the second of these, and she's going to be talking about her work in sort of political science of environmental issues. This is actually rather interesting, because most of the speakers we have are talking about energy from either an economic perspective or an engineering perspective. And energy is a field that tends to be dominated by engineers and economists. So it's actually very interesting and very important to have someone bringing a political science perspective, I think. There are relatively few political scientists who work actively in the field of politics of energy and the environment. So it's a great pleasure to have Leah here, able to represent that small but distinguished minority. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Scott Barrett, who's the Vice Dean of CEPA, and a very distinguished environmental economist. Scott will tell you a bit more about Leah and introduce Leah.
Oh, thanks so much, Geoff. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm delighted to welcome Leah to Columbia virtually, and we'll get you here in person as well. So Leah is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. One thing I'll say about Leah is that she's a Canadian, and she's an expert on American politics. And one thing we learned from Alexis de Tocqueville is that it sometimes takes an outsider to be able to understand a country's own political institutions and social institutions. So I think that's one thing to think about for Leah. She gets a certain extra advantage from having that perspective. She has a PhD in public policy from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. As Jason said, she's also a graduate of CEPA. And her work on the politics of energy and environment, the main thing I want to say, this is picking up on what Geoff was saying before, is that this is absolutely critical. I mean, anyone who's watched efforts to bring about policy change in these areas for the last 30 years has to appreciate just how important the politics of this are. And I think it's stunning that the profession or the discipline of political science has been rather neglectful of this area, with notable exceptions, close friends of mine, but relatively neglectful. And Leah is part of this new generation, I think, of younger people who are going to set us straight So we've made a lot of mistakes in the past, Leah, and you're going to sort us all out so that we not only come up with good ideas, but we actually see them implemented and adopted in legislation. So we're going to turn over to you, Leah, now to speak for about 10 or so minutes. You'll probably want to talk about your new report, a roadmap to 100% clean electricity by 2035. One critical part of that is a clean electricity standard, which is a different approach than we took the last round of federal efforts. And so I'd be interested in hearing from you what you think is attractive about this, not only maybe environmentally and economically, but especially politically. Why will this work when the other approaches haven't? So thanks so much, Leah. Welcome.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. As everybody said, I am a graduate of Columbia University. I first came to the United States to do my master's at Columbia, so I really have a special place in my heart for the university. And someday soon, hopefully, I will become a US citizen, and I'm very excited about that too. So in my work, I look a lot at clean electricity and the politics of getting to clean power. And I wrote a book last year called Short Circuiting Policy, which looks at the electric utility industry and how we can move faster and further ahead, really move at the pace and scale that's necessary in terms of cleaning up our electricity system. And what I discovered as part of that book is that we are not moving fast enough. Unfortunately, our electric utility industry has not been focused on the timelines and targets that are necessary. So we know that we have to be getting to 100% clean power as soon as possible. And what has been so exciting is to have President Biden and Vice President Harris campaign and win on a plan for 100% clean electricity by 2035. And with the election on January 5th in Georgia, which brought the Senate under Democratic control, we finally have an opportunity, again, for the first time in a decade, to pass comprehensive climate legislation this year in Congress. And the way that that is likely to happen, because unfortunately Republicans are not willing to come to the table on many things, let alone on climate action, is probably through budget reconciliation. So what is that? Basically, it's a process through which Congress can pass a law, typically about once a year, with only 50+1 votes. So normally, if you want to pass a law because of something called the filibuster, you need 60 votes. So it doesn't seem to matter that you have 50, it would be majority in the Senate, you also need to have 60 votes. So budget reconciliation allows us to continue to make progress and not have to wait or come up with an agreement that will work for 60 senators. Now, what's going to happen is that last year, the Republicans did not pass a bill using budget reconciliation. They did not pass a fiscal year 20 bill in this way, which means that the first bill that Congress is currently working on, which is the COVID relief package, is going to be following through that fiscal year 20 process. And the next bill, which we are hopeful will happen in the spring, will be the Biden and Harris Build Back Better agenda. And that really is a comprehensive idea about how to rebuild our economy, create millions of good paying and union jobs, and of course, address the climate crisis and the pollution crisis, which particularly hits communities of color the hardest. So the three big pledges that they made as part of their campaign was 1, 100% clean electricity by 2035. 2, $2 trillion of investments in this first term. So we're likely to see a pretty large investment package come together on this. And 3, 40% of those investments being targeted to disadvantaged communities. And that could be thought of as communities of color on the front lines of pollution. They can be thought of as fossil fuel extraction communities where people have been working in this industry and, need to make sure that they have jobs and communities going forward. And so I think that this approach really is a smart path forward. And while I was not at the very beginning of the primary, the biggest fan or the number one supporter of President Biden, I do find myself, with full honesty in this moment, extremely happy that he won the primary and is now our president. And why do I say that? Well, I think that he has a unique ability to broker bipartisan deals, to reach across, particularly to labor, and to make a really credible commitment, particularly to fossil fuel workers and communities in transition, that we will make these communities whole as we clean up our economy. That there does not need to be a trade-off between sort of jobs and economic opportunity and clean air and a stable climate. And so I'm really excited actually that he is at the head of this plan. And I think we've seen with all the announcements for staff across the board, whether that's, Secretary nominee, Secretary Granholm for the Department of Energy, people like Michael Regan for the Environmental Protection Agency, but even people in the White House, people like Sonia Agrawal and David Hayes, Maggie Thomas, Ali Zaidi, of course, Gina McCarthy. There have been so many amazing people who have stepped up to serve and who have been chosen to serve by this administration. And so I know we're going to have a very strong commitment to climate action from the administration. And we're also beginning to see signs that that will be matched in Congress. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer went on the Rachel Maddow show. I think it was only last week. It's hard to keep up with climate news in the Biden-Harris administration. And he went on the show and he said, she asked him, what is your top priority for legislation? And he said, climate. And he talked a lot about his Clean Cars for America proposal. But more generally, I think that the leadership in both the House and the Senate is very focused on climate change and sees climate action as the best opportunity we really have for economic recovery. So I'm a genuinely optimistic person. And today, as was mentioned, we put out a big report with Evergreen Action and Data for Progress. If you'd like to read it, you can go to evergreenaction.com/100clean, the number 100 and clean. And what we did over the last 7 months or so was try to figure out how can we pass a clean electricity standard through a budget reconciliation process? How can we design a clean electricity standard with justice and equity at its heart? And so the report lays out a lot of different ideas about how we can do this. And it also talks about complementary policies to make sure that the transition is equitable across the board. And I think that there are ultimately a lot of great ideas in this transition that can appeal to people all across the country. And so many people are realizing that it's time for the transition. Look at the kinds of announcements that we're seeing out of companies like GM, that they are going to stop making combustion engine cars by 2035. We have to keep pushing that even faster because that's not going to be fast enough for climate stability. But the fact is that even the industries are waking up to the reality that climate change is happening now, and we need to build the clean energy economy as fast as possible. So I'm really optimistic about the year ahead, and I think that it's going to be a very exciting time for climate policy. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with Professors Barrett and Heel, who I knew from way back when I was a nobody. I often told Professor Barrett that he came to the University of Toronto when I was an undergrad there many years ago now and gave a talk on climate change, and I went and saw it, and it was very important. And I actually took a whole course with Professor Heel when I was a master's student. So, these are sort of, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here in many ways. And hopefully this time we will start to actually get something done in Congress this year and finally pass the climate legislation that I'm sure you two have both been watching for decades and been slightly frustrated by not passing.
I've been following climate change since the 1980s. I think first wrote a paper on the economics of climate change in the 1980s. So it's been a very long time seeing nothing happen. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Before I ask you the questions, let me just make an announcement I should have made before, which is that last 15 or 20 minutes of this session will be devoted to Q&A from the audience. And if you look at your screen at the bottom of the bottom center on the right-hand side, there's a little button labeled Q&A. If you have a question for Leah, you can type it in there, and Scott and I will be able to read it and pass it on to her. So Leah, can you tell us a bit more about exactly what a clean power standard is? Because I don't think that's part of the general vocabulary right now. So maybe if you can elaborate on that just a little bit.
Oh, that's a good wonk tag for me, a jargon reminder, yes. So a clean electricity standard is a kind of an old idea in some ways. My book, Short Circuiting Policy, was about efforts to pass these policies at the state level. So those policies were initially called Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPSs. And Renewable Portfolio Standards set a target and a timetable. They said, we are going to have X% renewable energy by X year. And that's the same concept as a clean electricity standard. It's just that there are different eligible technologies. So now when we're targeting 100% clean, we have to include nuclear in that. We can include carbon capture and sequestration in that as well, right? We need a full suite of technologies, especially if we want to get to 100% clean. Because we know that as we get to higher and higher levels of renewables, there's more intermittency, meaning the wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. And so to have that grid stability 24/7, 365 days a year, we're going to need some other technologies as well. And that's really where the clean electricity standard idea comes from. And what people might not realize is that already more than 1 in 3 Americans live in a place that is targeting 100% clean power. We have 170 cities who have run ahead and passed these policies. We've got 16 states and territories, the latest being Arizona last year. We might see Illinois join in on the party this year. You know, there's so much momentum behind these ideas at the state and local level. And what we've been missing is the federal leadership to turn it away from a patchwork into a comprehensive plan for how we're going to get our electricity system cleaned up on the timeline that's necessary. So that's what a clean electricity standard is. It's a policy that sets the rules of the road and says, here's where we're going and by when. And it can even be designed, as we outline in our report, in a way that actually makes it easier for utilities to transition. We can provide resources to these companies to help them retire their coal plants that they have sunk debt into and to help them build clean energy. Because we know that today it's cheaper to run the electricity system with clean power. There are lots of coal plants that operate in the Southeast and the Midwest, which are uneconomic. There was, I think, a quote from the CEO of NextEra a day or two ago saying that there's not a single economic coal plant in this country, kind of a bold statement. And that wasn't me saying that, that was somebody in the power industry. So we've got to get rid of these coal plants. They cost people money, they cost people their lives in terms of air pollution, and they cost us our climate stability. So that's what this policy is. I think it's really exciting. And I'll also say part of the report that we put out today was polling with Data for Progress. And what you see again and again, they ran this in the fall around the election. They just ran it again in January. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communication has run this. And you know, more than 2/3 of voters support this approach. It's really popular, including amongst independents and even Republicans. So I think that this is a winning approach for the Democrats this year. And I'm really hopeful that we won't have to say that you've been studying climate change since the 80s and we never do anything. Hopefully we'll be able to say in a few months' time that, gosh, we actually did something on climate change.
Great, thank you. Let me just pick up one point that you mentioned earlier and then hand over to Scott for a little while. You mentioned, I think, that it was important to to provide support for people who lose their jobs because of the reduction in fossil fuel activities. I'm particularly sensitive to that because my father came from a coal mining community in South Wales in the UK. So could you say a little bit more about what you'd have in mind on that and how you'd handle that?
Yeah, well, I think that when President Biden was signing those executive orders on climate just 1 week ago, hard to believe, one of the things that he talked about was the coal miners and other fossil fuel people who have really built this economy. And while I might have very pointed criticisms for the fossil fuel industry, the people who own and operate these companies and who make enormous amounts of profit off of them and who have spread climate denial for decades. And I do have pointed words for those people. I think the reality is that the workers are not to blame at all. And they need to be brought along with the transition. And we have to be building good paying unionized jobs in the clean energy economy. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to really do that and deliver on the promises to date. And that's for a couple of reasons. We've done a lot of our clean energy policy through tax credits. And it's difficult to put labor standards in tax credits because the implementing agency, which is like the IRS, isn't really good at enforcing labor standards. Like, well, do you get this tax credit? Well, what does it mean to have a labor standard? That isn't really a very easy way to go about doing it. If instead we start to transition to grants, which is something that we did under the Recovery Act, there may be ways that we can make sure that labor standards are put at the center of these policies going forward and that we're really building up unionization rates in the clean energy economy. Because I think one of the challenges for unions right now is that they see that there are jobs in the extractive industry that are very highly paid, that come with a lot of benefits, and that the replacement jobs in the clean energy industry are not often unionized, and that they're not as highly paid, and they don't come with the same benefits. And so we have to make sure that this transition really does make sense for communities all across the country. And I think that in our report, if people are interested, the Evergreen Action and Data for Progress report, you can go to section 3.2, and we talk about the fossil fuel transition and how, things like debt on coal plants, how can we address that? And as we address those debt issues, how can we make sure that part of the money is flowing into communities, not just into the companies, right? The important thing to remember too, though, with all that said, is that fossil fuel companies fundamentally are not taking care of their own workers. During the pandemic, there have been massive layoffs in the fossil fuel economy, even though these companies have been receiving huge bailouts through, for example, the CARES Act. And there have been decisions made by some companies like ExxonMobil to cut employees during a pandemic and economic crisis rather than cutting their corporate dividend. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, are these companies actually protecting workers or not? And I think it is up to the federal government to step in and make sure that this transition is done in a way that's fair and equitable, including to fossil fuel workers.
It wouldn't actually be, I did some calculations once, it wouldn't actually be that expensive just to buy out coal miners.
Yeah.
Pay them their existing, I mean, there aren't that many of them and they're not very highly paid. So you could pay them their existing salaries until retirement in the event that they lose their jobs. Anyway, that's just a short remark. And Scott, if you let me hand over to you for a bit.
Well, I think that's a good question. And it connects with one of my main questions, which is, Leah, as you said, Jeff and I have been around for a while. And we've been working on
compliment. That was not an insult.
Well, I don't know. We've been working on this and we haven't had a huge amount of success in terms of change. And I'll just give as one reference point for people to think about with respect to the United States. There was an effort in 2009 to adopt something that at least I always remember as the Waxman-Markey bill, which was a bill very ambitious to reduce emissions in the US very substantially. And that was to be done by a system of emissions trading. There were other aspects to it as well, but that was a cornerstone of it. And it failed. It passed the House. It never came to a vote with the Senate. And I know times change. So one answer to my question of why we're going to succeed this time would be, well, times are different. As you said, General Motors is making an announcement, although, come on, these companies have been making announcements for decades about various things. So I'm not saying it's not sincere or it won't happen, but we have heard these things before. So is it the case that now is just different because the economics of renewable energy have changed relative to fossil fuels? Is it the polling? It can't be just the polling, because we know that people are in favor of all sorts of things, and Congress never adopts those laws that they want or say that they want. So that seems not to be sufficient. So I guess for someone trained in economics, I'm really interested, what is it politically? What do you need to do that we didn't do before, for example, in Waxman-Markey, in order to get the votes, number one, so that the legislation is passed. Number two, to ensure that the legislation is not subsequently reversed. And number three, to make sure that the legislation achieves what we need to achieve, which is elimination of greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, those are great points. So in terms of what's different now, I think a lot of things are different now. Climate change as an issue is way more politically salient, right? It's not just the polling, which I think is quite growing. In fact, I know that it's gone up a lot in the last several years in terms of public support. It's also the amount that people are talking about it, the amount it's being in the media. Look, there's like 670 people on this call. I don't think a couple of years ago, 670 people would have come to my niche subject on climate change and energy, right? Like we have really broken out into the mainstream in a big way. And I think a lot of the credit for that goes to people like Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Greta Thunberg, the Sunrise Movement, right? There's a lot of activists and movements out there on the front lines raising this issue and starting to break through. Another thing that's changed is the impacts of climate change are being felt now. And I think more and more people are making those connections. We can't look at, all of Australia burning around this time last year, and then last summer, the entire West Coast on fire, wiping out entire towns in Oregon, and not ask ourselves what's going on, or see these massive inland tornado, hurricane things that are completely unheard of and cause billions of dollars of damages in the Midwest, right? Or look at these hurricanes. There's so many impacts. So I think that this has really hit the mainstream, and it's now viewed by the Democratic Party as a winning issue, that the Democrats are on the right side of this issue and the public is behind them. And if they talk about it and they act on it, they'll be rewarded for it. Now, in terms of the risks in that strategy, my view is that climate policy needs to be done in a way that does not push costs onto consumers. I think that because I think we have a lot of income inequality in this country, including along racial and gender lines. During the pandemic, that's only gotten worse, as anybody knows who's read the news. And so I don't think that we want to make our climate policy about imposing costs on consumers. I think we want to make it about getting to the outcomes that we need in a way that is equitable. And so one of the things that I'm focused on is federal government investments, right? If the federal government is investing in this, whether that's through debt or revenues, ideally from a progressive taxation system, then we're not saying, okay, you're going to have to pay more on your electricity bills to finance this transition, or you're going to need to pay more at the pump. And it could be that after we begin this transition, particularly if we get this clean electricity standard in place, that later on we do raise the costs of fossil fuel pollution as we get further down the line. But at that moment in time, people will have been able to make the switch. The alternatives will be even more affordable. And if we have those incentives in place, like, for example, electric vehicle supports that are available to everybody, not just wealthy people who have the tax liability that makes, that allows them to use it, then people will say, yeah, it's cheaper for me to do this thing. It's healthier for me to do this thing. I like it better, right? So that's the kind of approach that I have. It's the standards approach where you say, here's where we're going for this sector by this timeline. Investments, we're going to put a lot of money in from the federal government rather than raising money off the backs of consumers. And justice, we're going to make sure that those resources are going to fossil fuel communities of color, and really making the transition work. And as far as the clean electricity standard is concerned, and this backlash idea, I wrote a whole book on that subject. There certainly has been backlash against renewable portfolio standards, but it's a lot less than you would see, for example, with carbon pricing. And as utilities are getting more comfortable with the clean energy transition, I think we're going to start flipping some of them into being allies. It's already starting to happen. And I am, as anybody who listens to me knows, a big critic of the utility industry. Indeed, last week I released a report with the Sierra Club, grading them all and giving about half of them Fs. So I'm certainly not an apologist or Pollyanna for the utility industry, but I'm starting to see indications that the utility industry understands that this is what the government wants, this is what the public wants, and that if they can do it, if they can deliver on, let's say, 80% clean power by 2030, which is what all the utilities in Colorado are doing right now, if they can do that, then guess what? They can power a lot more of our economy. They're not just going to power the electricity system. They're going to power parts of transportation. They're going to power our buildings. They're even going to power about half of heavy industry. So the electric utility industry, an industry I have studied, going back to like the 1880s, it has the biggest growth opportunity in over a century with this clean energy transition. And once the executives and utilities start to understand that, I hope that they're going to become Goliaths on the team of climate action, and that will really transform the politics in a way that we haven't seen before.
I'm muted, of course. I love Zoom. I just want to follow up, Leah, to make sure I understand, because I received your report, which, by the way, I've asked that the link be made available to the many people who are participating in this event. So I just want to make sure I understand. So you're recommending a clean electricity standard. Now, I assumed I only have 30 seconds to look at your report, so I have not read it.
It's about 60 pages, so yeah.
Okay. All right, but I had assumed that meant that there was an obligation borne by the utilities. And if that is true, then how is it the case that the cost would not be borne by electricity consumers ultimately? Where exactly is the federal government paying for this? So what you're proposing, I believe from what you said, is that the cost is going to be borne by US taxpayers and not by electricity consumers. Is that correct? And
Yes.
How does that work? Why would you even need a standard?
Well, the first thing to note is that what modeling from lots of groups, like if you want to look at the 2035 report, 2035report.com, shows is that actually moving to, let's say, 90% clean electricity by 2035 would actually save customers money. So it's not just me saying that we can do this transition and save customers money, it's what lots of modelers show. And why is that? Because there's a lot of those uneconomic coal plants that I talked about. So if we can retire those coal plants and build cheaper, cleaner electricity, we could potentially pass those savings on to customers. Now, that transition is tricky because those utilities still have debt. And so we have to figure out a way of getting rid of that debt. And there's lots of ideas for how to do that. We can restructure utilities debt. We can do things like securitization, which some states have been doing, basically figure out ways to reduce that debt burden, get a plan to pay it off, pass on some of those benefits to the local community, pass on some of those benefits of the savings to the customer. So that's one way to deal with the debt problem around coal plants. The ideas that we propose in this report are designed to work with budget reconciliation. And as I mentioned, budget reconciliation is a process by which you can pass a bill a year that is budgetary. And so the way we design this clean electricity standard is that the federal government would be buying these zero emission certificates, basically. So these are credits. These are ways of keeping track of how much clean power that we have. And we could say, okay, all the utilities need to make a lot more clean power. And if they do it, we're going to give them these certificates from the government, and we're going to give them some money alongside it. And we can give them that certificate and the money through an auction-based system to try to keep the cost low and make everybody participate. We can do it through a more on-the-books crediting system where the government just gives the credits to anybody who makes the clean power. And if they don't do it, they're not meeting their requirements, then what they do is they pay an alternative compliance payment, which is a really standard thing in all of these clean energy standards designs. It's basically a fee, a penalty for not complying. And so the place where we could see costs go up for consumers is if a lot of these utilities choose to pay alternative compliance payments, right? Because then they'd be paying a fee. That would be an additional cost on the system, and then they would pass those costs on to customers. But if you know the utility industry, you know that they don't like doing that. They do not like paying fines and fees. They like complying with policies. They want to have a policy that they know they can comply with. And if we give a carrot, like here are some resources if you do the right thing, I think we'll see the vast majority of utilities actually doing that. So that is sort of the vision for how this works. And I hope that helps explain how we are unlikely to see customer bills go up with this kind of an approach.
So just one last follow-up, and then I want to move to another topic. And I should say that while we're having this conversation, I'm looking on my screen and all sorts of wonderful questions coming from the audience. We'll come to that later, as Jeff said. Just to make sure I understand this, does that mean that if I'm that you're basically going to have a system, let's say it's an auction, doesn't have to be, I guess, from what you said, I'm not sure, but where I'm if I'm a utility, I'm basically saying I'm willing to reduce emissions by some amount, and I'm willing to do it if you pay me some price, and I'm going to compete against other utilities in trying to offer the lowest price for getting those reductions, and then the government is going to be looking at those offers, as it were, and then going with the low cost ones first and then working up, and they've got some total budget. Is that how it's going to work? Something like that?
Yeah, that is how it could work. The only difference is that it doesn't have to be emissions. It could be designed with emissions being the target, but typically in a clean electricity standard, it's done on units of generation, so megawatt hours. So I'm going to create X amount of clean megawatt hours, and the government would say we need to have, it's year 2030. We got to be hitting 80% clean megawatt hour. So we take all the generation and we take 80% of that, 0.8, and we got to find, enough of that capacity out there. No, sorry, enough of that generation out there and meet that requirement. So yes, that is the idea. And, the auction-based system, which economists might like more, right, could keep costs lower because all these different entities would be bidding, and maybe it'd be quite low because the marginal cost of the transition is quite small. Another benefit of that approach is that lots of different actors can participate. It's not just utilities that can build new clean stuff and participate in this system. It's also independent power producers. And I'll say that actually New York State has been using this kind of approach to be building new clean energy. It's slightly different because they're actually procuring both the power and the zero emission certificates, I believe, versus this is just that additional marginal attribute called, this is clean power, and you get paid a little bit more because it's clean power. So it's not that the government would be buying all these contracts for all this stuff in the market. Utilities would still be contracting through their normal procurement processes. It's just that there would be a little bit more resources coming from the federal government to make sure that we are on track at the pace and scale that's necessary. So that is some of the ideas that we put forward in the report. But I'll also say there's lots of other ideas in the report that don't necessarily follow this logic. Even things like block grants for states. And block grants for states don't necessarily have to be used for a clean electricity standard, but let's say states wanted to create an incentive program for customers electrifying their homes and getting rid of fossil gas in their stoves or their furnaces or something like that. Well, the federal government could give a block grant out to a state and say, take this money and run an incentive program for building electrification, something like that. So, there's lots of different ways that we can think about getting money out the door to getting things built. But that's really got to be the goal here. The federal government has to help seed a little bit of this. And then the market, I think, ultimately will pick up a lot of this, and we'll get our entire economy humming along and ultimately create millions of good paying jobs along the way. So yeah, those are some of the ideas that we put forward in this report out today.
Great. Maybe I'll ask one more question, and then Jeff, you can take over after I do that. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right. So the perspective that I'm always interested in is the global one, and that's because climate is a global problem. It's also because in the past, one of the reasons that the US has held back is the belief, or at least the excuse, that others weren't stepping up, or that the US couldn't rely on others to step up. And you see this, for example, in the complaints made in the Byrd-Hagel resolution, non-binding resolution adopted by the Senate in advance of the Kyoto Protocol, that the US didn't want to sign an agreement in which other countries, large countries like China, were not also committed. And you saw that also in Waxman-Markey, which is a bill that's 1,400 pages long. But the first paragraph was actually not about the United States at all. It was all about China and India, and they were mentioned by name. And in particular, it seems from this that the US might be more willing to act if it had confidence that others were going to act, and that as a consequence, competitiveness was somehow, the playing field was kept even in some sense, and at the same time that the problem was solved because it's a global problem. So I haven't heard much in the discussion of a Green New Deal, or in my 30-second look at your your report about the global picture and how these connect. But it seems that connection historically has been very important, and I'm sort of curious what you think about that.
Well, I think you use the word excuse as part of your explanation of some of the reasons why, maybe we're not acting. I think, and this is informed by some of my colleagues in political science, Michael Akelin and Matto Mildenberger have a piece on this in the journal Global Environmental Politics. And they look at, is it true that countries are conditional cooperators or not on something like climate change? And they find generally that no, it's not true, that a lot of what's happening is domestic politics. And people are using international inaction as an excuse for domestic inaction that they wanted anyway, like the fossil fuel industry or particular politicians who didn't want to do something on climate in the first place, potentially because they were funded by the fossil fuel industry. So I know that's a slightly different perspective than you might have, or the literature often has on this subject. But my view actually is kind of informed by work by people like Greg Nemeth, who studies technology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I believe. And he wrote a book called How Did Solar Get Cheap? And that's kind of how I tend to think about the global nature of this challenge. He looked at how, Germany acted first and they passed those feed-in tariff policies. And initially, I studied this because Ontario, Canada also passed a feed-in tariff, and I wrote papers about that. But the initial costs were like 80 cents a kilowatt hour, like really, really high. Let's just put it that way. And then, they paid for that learning curve. We know that as we make more of a technology, the costs fall. And so a country like Germany going ahead of everybody else, which from the logic of collective action doesn't really make sense. There was some domestic reason why they did it. Well, they brought down the costs. And then he talks about how China stepped in, and China really pioneered manufacturing at scale and figuring out how to bring down the cost of solar panels even further. And of course, the US has also played a role in this, and that is something that I write about in my book, Short-Circuiting Policy, sort of the history of renewables. There was, the PURPA in the 1978, and then the tax credits in the 1980s, and so on and so forth. So I tend to think of things as kind of, that's maybe a little technology centric, but it's how the politics of a place leads to changes in the economics and the technology, and how those changes can then spill over across states, right? Nation states. So that now we have solar all around the world that is so much cheaper than we would have if these countries hadn't acted. So I tend to think that countries are doing things in these piecemeal ways for their own domestic reasons, and that there are then spillovers, whether there are technology, economics, or even political spillovers in terms of creating companies that maybe then go lobby in new places or open up new markets for clean energy technology. So that kind of approach tends to leave me more hopeful, because I'm not waiting for, a big Paris 2.0, or which we're going to have actually in April, right? They've announced that they're going to have a big global summit on this in April. I think that all of us, in whatever domestic context we find ourselves in, have to be pushing for the most aggressive action at that domestic scale. And then what's so helpful about something like the Paris Agreement with the nationally determined contributions process is that now we have an accounting system, kind of like we know if we're on track for clean electricity or not. We can know if we're on track globally with all our piecemeal domestic actions to the global outcome. And I think that in many ways, that is a really critical part of the process, that we can keep track and we can say, okay, guys, you said you wanted to limit warming to 2 degrees or 1.5 or whatever we agreed to, and you're on track for 2.5 or 3 or whatever it is. And so that's kind of the approach that I tend to take to these issues. And I also think that there's another role, which is capacity, whether that's through technology transfer and support, whether that's through literally money being flown from the domestic north to the south. And, those are some of the ways that we're going to help bring other countries along in the transition, particularly in parts of the world that don't have as much capacity necessarily to make the transition financially.
Great. Over to Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, Leah, for emphasizing the role that Germany played, German feed-in tariffs played in bringing the cost down. I think that's something people easily forget. But the cost of solar, I've been teaching a course on renewable energy, and when I started teaching the course, the cost of solar panels was $8 per watt. Today, it's 80 cents per watt. It's a remarkable drop in cost. And that's only 7 or 8 years that's happened. So the drop in price has been precipitated. And that's been driven, as you rightly said, essentially by learning by doing in economies of scale, which come from just really 2 countries, Germany and China, ramping up demand enormously. And I think the RPSs at the state level in the US have also added to that as well and helped bring us down the cost curve. Let me ask you a rather different kind of question. Climate and environment in general are a very partisan issue here in the US today. So it's a Democratic administration which is taking action after a Republican administration which did everything it possibly could to essentially dilute the environment and roll out back these standards. That hasn't always been the case. I mean, if you ask most environmental groups who are the most environmentally benign presidents in the US history, they usually list Teddy Roosevelt first, and Richard Nixon second, and Lyndon Johnson third. I think that's EDF's sort of list of heroes, is those three in that order. The Clinton-Gore administration did nothing on the environment, for example, although it was a very environmentally oriented group there. So why is it that things have switched? The environment has been switched from being a conservative Republican issue to being a Democratic issue? What's made that transit? Is it climate change, or is it something more than that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually something that's at the core of my book, Short Circuiting Policy, and really builds actually on my late mentor, Judy Lazer's earlier book, Open for Business. She wrote this study looking at the history of the environmental movement and how business came to attack environmental legislation on lots of different things, whether that was like things like the spotted owl and logging fights or climate issues, et cetera. And so I think what's happened is that industries in certain cases have come to realize that a given environmental policy, whether that's climate policy or Endangered Species Act, something like that, is affecting their profits and they don't like it. And so what they do is that they have been dragging the Republican Party away from environmental leadership. And I don't just say that rhetorically. I'll say too that Senator Whitehouse very much has the same theory that I have as an actual senator. But what I find in my book is that if you just rewind the clock to the 90s on renewable energy, this was an extremely bipartisan idea. And things like a renewable portfolio standard, which is now called a clean electricity standard, and is this policy we've been talking about, a lot of these things were pioneered in Republican states because they were seen as, they have some market-based like mechanisms, such as these renewable electricity certificates we've been talking about, that, we can do this in a least cost way, right? We can have competition and things like that. And so Governor George W. Bush signed into law a clean energy target in Texas before California even acted. That's the reality. And so we did have a long period of bipartisanship on this. And so what happened? Well, my book makes the argument that what has happened in climate change is what's happened in lots of different American politics issues, which is called asymmetric polarization. If you're familiar with the work of the political scientists, Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson, they've done a lot of work looking at polarization in the United States. And what they argue, and what a lot of other people's work in the discipline looking at what's called ideal points, which is like estimates of where somebody is on an ideological gradient, is that the Democrats have stayed pretty stable. Like, you might think we're all radicals or whatever, socialists or something like that, but we're pretty much the same. We're kind of middle of the road. And what's happened is that the Republicans have pulled away and become an extremist party. And you can just look at the current debates in the House that playing out over this QAnon member, which to see what I mean when I say that. But that has been so much the case in climate policy. And so where does that come from? Why did the Republican Party pull away from this? Well, what I argue in my book is that fossil fuel companies and electric utilities have used the party system to pull the Republican Party away from climate action. And they've done that through, for example, primary challenges for Republicans who are pro-clean energy or pro-climate action. And were I to be a game theoretic modeler, which I am not, but were I to be, what I would do is write a little game which would show that what happens when you start primarying somebody on an issue. Well, not only might you change that particular person, right? Like, let's say you win and they're no longer in Congress. This is what happened with Bob Inglis, for example, a Republican from South Carolina who was a climate champion and who got primary. Well, now, so I've literally swapped in a non-climate person for a climate person. But even if I lose, which is what happened, for example, in Kansas with this representative named Russ Jennings, even if I lose, you've created an incentive, right? You've said, gosh, if you don't get on the right side of this issue, you could lose your funding, and everybody else is watching you in your caucus go through this terrible primary fight. And they think, gosh, I don't want to deal with that. I just want to keep my job and just, not have to deal with loss of funding from the party or from the fossil fuel industry. And in the case of Kansas, one of the things I study in the book, and the case of this Representative Jennings, who was pro-wind energy and did not want to get rid of this law, he did find himself with a well-funded primary challenger. And, you ask, well, why does it matter if the fossil fuel industry doesn't like him? Well, where does he get his money from to run for office? First, from the Kansas Republican Party. What is one of the top donors to the Kansas Republican Party? Koch Industries. Okay, second, the Chamber of Commerce. What's one of the top donors there? Koch Industries. And then third, Koch Industries. And so the relationship between the fossil fuel industry and the Republican Party is very symbiotic. And this is something, again, that Senator Whitehouse says all the time. And it has created this situation that if you dare to go offside publicly on climate change, you're going to be primaried. And, you'll hear many conservative right-wing groups who care about climate change, of which there are many, say that when they talk behind closed doors to representatives or senators from the Republican Party that they do care and they do want to act, but they can't do that publicly because the stakes are too high. And it's really sad because when you look at the polling for young Republicans, we can see that there's a huge generational gap, actually, where young Republicans are really worried about climate change and they're not being represented by their party. And so I'm hopeful that this will start to shift and that we'll start to see some of that pressure coming from younger members of the party. But right now, unfortunately, there's a real stranglehold that the fossil fuel industry has over the Republican Party.
That's very interesting indeed. Thank you. But presumably the power of the fossil fuel industry is going to decline quite sharply.
It does seem to be doing that. Things like, falling off the S&P 500 or that kind of thing.
Yeah, big oil companies just declaring major losses. Exxon, I think, the biggest loss in its history in the last quarter.
We're on the slow decline, and
yes.
that's going to be brutal for workers, right? And that's why I raised this issue of the worker issue, because we need there to be a transition that's fair for people, and the companies aren't going to be the ones to make sure that happens.
Yeah, let me raise another point which is connected to this, which is, I'm from the UK, obviously. And I compare the Republican Party here in the US and its attitude on environment and climate issues with the Conservatives in the UK. And Boris Johnson is a very conservative UK Prime Minister, and he's far to the right by UK standards. But nevertheless, he's very enthusiastic about taking action on climate change. He wants it to be one of his big issues. And he's pretty positive in general on a wide range of environmental issues. And that's common. That's true of several European conservative parties. So there's a huge difference between conservatism and environment in Europe versus conservatism and environment in the US. Now, that's the same phenomenon? You think this is just the fact that the US is a petrostate essentially? Whereas
it's a materialist argument, exactly, right? Look what happened. Thatcher broke the coal industry, as you know well, right?
Yeah.
And so it sounds like firsthand. And so, the politics have really shifted. We don't now have those labor unions or the companies with the same amount of political power anymore in the UK. And so we can see conservatives, not being as wedded to the fossil fuel industry in that particular case. And I will say too that it can also go on the left, right? We can have fossil fuel intensive unions also be a challenge when it comes to the transition. And I am very hopeful that that's changing. And one of the most hopeful things about that was that when President Biden was running for office, he had a lot of support from the IBEW and other workers. And so I think that more and more parts of the union movement are starting to see that the clean energy transition is really the future, and that, yes, there are going to be job losses in the fossil fuel industry, and we've got to figure out how we manage that transition, because whether or not we want it to come or, it's coming. Think about how much Trump tried to slow down coal from closing and how much he just failed in large part. So it's a little bit inevitable. But yes, I think the materialist argument that I've put forward really does make sense, not just for the United States.
I guess in this context, it becomes particularly important that the US has such a poor social safety net, and that the risk, the financial risk associated with unemployment are just huge here. Whereas in Europe, most European countries, if you lose your job, you have some assurance of a reasonably decent income for at least a year afterwards, and in many cases more than that. So maybe it's very important to facilitate this change to take some action on that front.
I totally agree with you. And that is why I argue that I don't think this should be a consumer-facing costs approach in the United States. We don't really have a social safety net that's going to allow people to manage the costs of rising electricity bills or rising bills at the pump. Right now during the pandemic, we have a huge crisis where all these people are in arrears on their electricity bills and even being threatened with having shutoffs. And so my concern is that if we put this as a very consumer-facing policy, there can be particular backlash against it. And we don't really have that social safety net in this country that's going to make it easier for people to manage those transition costs. And it also means, as you said, that without like healthcare as a right, or without, unemployment that's actually going to help people at the scale that's necessary, it's really hard when we go through these fossil fuel transitions because people don't have something else to rely on. And no wonder they're so freaked out about what the consequences will be for their communities. So, there's real consequences to the inequality and the lack of social safety net in this country, including on climate change. And I think we have to be very clear-eyed about that, because if we pass a policy that just raises the cost of energy for everybody and is deeply unpopular, then the Democrats will lose potentially. And then it'll be really hard to continue the clean energy transition for the decade that is necessary.
Let me just make one more point on that, which is that, we're talking about decarbonizing the economy. And the obverse of decarbonization in many cases is electrification. We want to move people away from gasoline vehicles to electric vehicles, away from oil and gas heating to electric heating and so on. So the pricing of electricity is going to be very important in that context.
Absolutely.
And at the moment, it would be, at current electricity prices, it would actually be ridiculously expensive for me to heat my apartment by electricity.
Yes.
So actually, we have to think about something we have to think about, which not many people, I think, are thinking about, is how to manage the pricing of electricity so that it's possible, particularly for low-income groups, to handle the electrification. It's going to become
the only thing, though, so you're right, except I've been doing a lot of research and I'm personally electrifying my home right now, and I have an electric car and all that. The only thing is that these appliances are much more efficient. So you're actually using a lot less kilowatt hours overall. So, it's not really like a 1-for-1. If you were to go get a new induction stove rather than using your gas stove, which, by the way, great for your health, turns out you're basically poisoning yourself by burning something inside your house. It's not going to be more expensive for you to operate, because these are really efficient appliances. Things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, right? The costs of ownership are like very low. I have an EV, and honestly, I think it costs like $5 to charge it. And you can't say that it costs $5 to fuel your car, right? It costs more like $50, depending on how big your gas tank is. So, and that's for, driving 300 miles. So, there can be a lot of savings. The challenge is more the upfront costs of the transition, right? Because people have to foot the bill and then they get the savings over time. And that's where things like incentives are going to be really important, especially for lower income communities, to be able to afford the upfront costs.
Great, thanks. Scott, should we hand over to you? And should we perhaps start thinking about taking some questions from the audience?
Jeff, I'm ahead of you. I've been looking at the questions coming in, and they're terrific. So we not only have a sizable audience, but a very well-informed audience. And my gratitude to everyone for these great questions. The way we're arranging this is I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming in. I'm looking for ones that where you see several in the same kind of area, and I'm just going to put some of these in my own words. I guess we'll do these one at a time. One question that's come up is, why would a clean electricity standard be more effective than a carbon tax? Or other people have mentioned carbon pricing, as you might get through tradable permit systems and things like that. So what's the advantage? Because we know that you get, and you kind of referred to this a little bit earlier, you get cost effectiveness in some sense from using these approaches. That's all with respect to some kind of goal, of course. So what is it that makes the clean electricity standard attractive compared to those options?
Well, I'll just say first that it doesn't have to be an either or, right? It wasn't an either or in the Waxman-Markey bill. There was a whole massive trading, permitting, carbon pricing part to it, but there was also a renewable portfolio standard. I think what I'm advocating is that we flip the kind of emphasis here, that we emphasize more the standard side of things, and that we use these pricing and incentives things less, and we don't expect them to do as much of the work. And those are for all the reasons that we've been talking about equality, about our social safety net, who should be paying for the transition, not just how much does the transition cost. So those are my reflections after, a decade of thinking about this. When I was a master's student at Columbia in 2009, the EU ETS was implemented and it was the coolest thing. And I wrote a paper about it and we were all talking about carbon pricing. And I think, more than a decade on, we've seen the limitations of these carbon pricing systems, that the prices are often very low because the system is set up with a lot of free allowances. The cap is not as tight as it needs to be. Look at Reggie, for example, which operates in the Northeast. The price is trading at like $5 a ton, and that's not going to push the system to the deep decarbonization we need at the timeline that's necessary. And a colleague of mine, Jessica Green at the University of Toronto, just published a new paper in Environmental Research Letters, which went through a meta-analysis of all the econometric studies on carbon pricing in practice. And what she shows is that, it's kind of 0 to 2% a year under the best case scenario in terms of decarbonization. And that's good, but you can't tell me that you think that's going to solve the whole problem when I'm telling you we have to cut emissions by about half by 2030, right? So the reason why I like the clean electricity standard is because I think it cleans up a huge part of the problem. Our electricity sector, as we've been talking about, is going to be that linchpin. It's going to be the backbone that's going to fuel all the other parts of our economy. We also have to have standards on cars. We have to have standards on buildings, right? We got to go sector by sector and really get these policies in place. And if people really want to put an incentive in place, I think we have to be realistic about how high it's going to be and therefore what the outcomes will be. And I'll also say this is very informed by a book called Carbon Captured: How Labor and Business Control Climate Politics by Matto Mildenberger, where he also studied carbon pricing in Norway and Australia and the United States and found sort of a similar effect. And we wrote a piece together in the Boston Review, making these arguments. So people can disagree with me, and obviously many do, and that's totally legitimate. But my view is that we want things to be popular and like sustainably popular, and that slapping people with fees probably won't get us the emissions cut that we need at the pace that's necessary, because we're not going to get the price high enough. And it will potentially be quite unpopular. So that's kind of the approach that I tend to advance, but it is not incompatible. We could see an economy-wide carbon price come out of Congress. That is a bit of a stretch. We don't see economy-wide carbon prices pretty much anywhere, but maybe the United States will do it this year, to be determined.
Okay. There's another question that's come up in different guises, but they have to do with budget reconciliation. And I think the underlying concern here is, if the Democrats pursue this to get a deal passed, might the Republicans subsequently say, well, that was illegitimate, and we have the power now because there's been a switch from an election, and they're now going to repeal it. So how do you see that being played out in the effort to bring about this kind of outcome?
Well, I think that's an understandable concern that people have. But the fact is that we know from political science research that the status quo becomes rather sticky. Think about the Affordable Care Act, right? The Republicans wanted to get rid of that, and they never quite managed to do it. And they had the power, theoretically, to do that. I think we might worry about that, and there's reasons to be concerned. But my view is that if we pass this standard and target, let's say 80% by 2030, putting us on that pathway to 100% by 2035, utilities are going to get into compliance mode, the vast majority of them. That's what they're so good at. Utilities are like compliance entities, and they're going to start meeting the target, and they're going to start going along at the pace and the scale, and they're going to say, gosh, we're getting money from this. This is really working well. And they're not going to want it to be repealed. That's actually what I think. It's interesting. I've talked to some people in the utility industry recently, and they have some regret about the Waxman-Markey bill and it not passing, to be honest. With hindsight, they're like, we got a really good deal there. We probably should have passed it. So I think that this is not just going to be like jammed through against the will of, fossil fuel workers or, utilities or something like that. It's going to be a brokered deal, and it's going to be something that is stable and sticky as a result. And I think that the more we can put the costs onto the general government balance sheets, as we have done, by the way, for like a century with fossil fuel subsidies to the tune of $20 billion annually. It's not like we never do these things. We do these things all the time. It's just that what are we doing them for? So I think let's use that kind of an approach for clean electricity, as we've been doing for the fossil fuel industry for a century. And I think that will be a much more sustainable and less politically contentious pathway forward. So that's generally the way that I think about it.
Great. There are some other questions about technology. So some people have been asking about carbon capture. Some people have been asking about electricity transmission, and some about storage. And there are probably a lot of others. I haven't read every single comment yet, but there are several about
There's got to be a
technology.
nuclear question too. There's always
And
a
nuclear, yeah,
question.
nuclear as well. Yeah, nuclear as well. And I guess the way I would package all these different kinds of questions are about we know that all these different components can be important, and certainly in a general sense, they all are. But how would they, some of them are not fully developed. So is there a role here for R&D? Is it the case that there's going to be some, let's say, so economists sometimes speak in terms of push and pull incentives.
Yeah.
So a pull would be something like, an electricity standard that sets a really high price in a market for renewable energy and attracts capital to fulfill that need. A push would be something like, we're going to fund R&D into, the solar panels that will follow the sun, or something like, whatever it is, something like that, or in carbon capture with storage of capture of carbon and batteries and so on. So how do you see those two? Maybe that's the right way to ask this. Is this something that you're going to rely mainly? You're going to set the standard and let the market do this, so it's being driven by pull, or is it there's going to be coupled with a push?
Well, the fact is that we should and must be spending more on research and development. And I think there's been really great calls and reports coming out of the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, as everybody would know on this call. So there's been really great work done by people like, for example, Varun Sivaram, who's now working in the administration. So, there's always a space for R&D. It is very important. We have been underinvesting in it, but at the end of last year, in a bipartisan fashion, championed by people like Senator Murkowski, we saw, the beginnings of a big investment in that. And so, I don't worry about finding money for R&D. It has to be a priority for sure. We aren't doing enough of it, but the reality is that there's support for that, and there will be support for that, and we will keep trying to do that. What I worry more about is getting done what we can get done at the pace and scale that's necessary today. We can worry endlessly about the last 10 to 20% of electricity, and do we have the technologies, and and we should be investing in those areas. But you know what? We're only at 40% right now, 40% clean, and we need to get to 80% clean by 2030. So we have to have those pull incentives, as you put it, getting this clean energy built at the scale that's necessary. And then we will need to have lots of other complementary technologies to make sure that it all fits together. There are going to be big investments, I'm sure, in batteries. There was some actually in that omnibus bill from December. There's going to be new approaches to transmission. I'm sure of it because people like David Hayes is in the White House and he knows an enormous amount about these issues. And so I know that there's going to be a lot of focus on these issues and on advanced nuclear and carbon capture and storage and all these kinds of things. But we also have to do the other thing, which is just build a lot of clean power at a very fast pace. At the very best year, we've built about 2 percentage points of clean energy. And last year, during the pandemic, was the best year for renewables yet. Who knew? But we've got to be getting up to 4 percentage points every year from now until 2030 to be hitting that 80% target. And so, we gotta scale things up, is what I'm trying to say, and that will require pull. So there's always room and space and importance for more research and development, and I'm definitely not against that. And I don't even think there's really a tension here. I think that these two things go alongside each other very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Leah. Jeff, I think we've got 2 minutes left. I wonder, do you want to sneak in a last quick one, or how do you want to wrap this up?
Well, let me just ask Leah one more question, which do what you've been doing, which is summarizes a bunch of questions in the Q&A, which is the distributive effect of an aggressive push towards clean energy. I mean, you've indicated a couple of times that you think this could be positive rather than negative, but I think it will be useful for many people if you were to elaborate on that a little bit and explain more what you think about is the distributive effect here, and then that'll be the last discussion. We'll end the discussion after that.
Yeah, I absolutely think that from a distributive perspective, this is an equality policy, right? Let's think about a few things. The fossil fuel-based system is not based on equality. It's based on putting toxic infrastructure in communities of color. We've had reports for decades now by groups like the NAACP showing us that like the vast majority of Black Americans live within 60 miles of a coal plant. We know that Black children have asthma rates of 2 times the amount of white children. And you'll drive through some neighborhoods, for example, parts of LA, where you have massive refineries, and there are literally schools backing on to those refineries, and those are overwhelmingly Hispanic communities. We have so much research showing that the benefits of the current fossil fuel system are flowing to white people, and the costs are being put into Black, Latinx, and Indigenous bodies. So that's just the facts of things. And I don't think we have been clear enough about that really until the last year, where I think the environmental movement has come to understand the inextricable links between fossil fuels and racism, to be honest. So that is one part of the transition that is all about equality. And I think also when we think about the fact that continuing to operate coal plants is costing people money in their electricity bills, we know that this transition can be saving people money in their bills. And electricity bills can be a really big household expense for people. The EIA many years ago did a study that said 1 in 3 Americans struggle to pay their electricity bills. And that was before the pandemic or the economic crisis. So, this has really got to be about making sure that everybody can come along and really making sure that we rectify the historic injustices, which, when we talk about racism in this country, it's not just about slavery, right? It's not just about discrimination. It's also about environmental harms and pollution. There's this amazing study that came out of the US Census. People can look it up. I think it's like something like your grandmother's air. And it looked at, using an amazing econometric approach, the effect of the Clean Air Act on not just people in one generation and not just their children, but their children's children. And so think about the intergenerational inequalities that we have been imposing largely on Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities by putting these toxic fossil fuel projects in their backyards. The effects are stunning. It's just crazy to look at that paper. So, ultimately, I think that this transition has to be about justice, and that has to be a distributive system that is equal and that starts to undo a lot of the inequality in our society.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Leah. Let me end up by thanking Jason Bordoff from the Center for Global Energy Policy very much indeed for hosting this. And thanking you, Leah, for a really fascinating and very lucid, very persuasive presentation. You've done a really great job. And you've held an audience of over 500 people for the last hour.
I know. Why did they all come here? Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, so let me thank the audience too, and also thank them particularly for the questions. I mean, we haven't been able to do justice to the questions. There are well over 100 questions, but we've tried to summarize a reasonable range of them. So thank you very much indeed. That's great. Thank you very much.